Hey friends, welcome to the next lesson of Baking School with Jami. Today we are covering coffee cakes. All right, you are never gonna go to Starbucks and order a coffee cake again, or pick one up at Costco to bring for dessert over to someone's house, because once you learn how easy it is to make incredible coffee cake yourself, you're gonna be baking it every opportunity you can get. In fact, my cinnamon streusel coffee cake is like my signature coffee cake because it's my personal favorite. And I bring it everywhere and people just ooh and ah every time I bring it because it's just such a fun treat. And it's very different than a lot of desserts you think to bring. A lot of times people will bring a chocolate cake, which can be great, or cupcakes, or they'll pick up donuts, but bringing over a handmade, absolutely delicious coffee cake, it's just amazing. And that's what we're gonna chat about today. We're gonna give some best tips and tricks for making those coffee cakes. Now, as a reminder, before we get into it, you can head over to bakingschoolwithjami.com to access all the printables and recipes for free that go along with each and every lesson. You don't have to pay for a thing. Every lesson will come up with a fantastic, simple recipe for you to do right alongside me. So you can go back and watch our past episodes where we have made all kinds of great recipes already. And then watch until the end of this lesson, because today you're gonna learn how to make, you guessed it, an amazing coffee cake. Now, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss another episode of Baking School with Jami. All right, so there are so many different ways that you can make coffee cakes, and there's a lot of different kinds. Now, some of those use yeast to leaven. So a lot of times you'll find some that are more of kind of a yeast bread coffee cake, which are fantastic, but we're not gonna get into those today. We're not diving into yeast breads yet. Today, we're gonna focus on the quick bread varieties of coffee cake. And the great thing about this is that you can throw them together in like 20, 30 minutes or less, and they can be fast, easy done. Whenever you're dealing with yeast breads, you have to wait for the rise and you gotta wait for all that. But with quick breads, we can throw these together in a pinch. Coffee cakes are absolutely delicious because they usually have this delightful like outer crumb with a soft, springy kind of cake inside. But the trouble with coffee cakes is how easy it is to make it too dry inside. You have probably had coffee cakes before that looked delicious, but were way too dry, way too dry. Now, we want moist and delicious cakes that pair perfectly with a cup of coffee or tea, and they can work well as breakfast, snacks. They're perfect for hospitality, and when they're quick breads, they're really simple. So before we get to actually baking our cake, we're gonna go over a few tips. Tip number one for making your coffee cake is that you want to store your coffee cake in an airtight container. This is going to help tremendously to lock that moisture in to keep it nice and moist. I personally like to wait until I'm serving the coffee cake before I slice it, because once you kind of slice into it and separate those pieces, you're going to kind of have that countdown started for how long it's going to stay moist. But a cake carrying case works really well for this. So if you want to leave the coffee cake out on your counter, just make sure you have it in an airtight container, or get one of those cake, oh, I have one right up there. It's too late, I forgot to grab it. But you know, one of those little, I'll link to it for you. One of those cake carrying cases that like lock so that they're nice and airtight, which also makes it really easy to transport for hospitality. So if you're making a coffee cake for someone to bring tomorrow, you can just put it in there and it'll last, and then you can also transport it really easily. But you wanna just make sure that it is airtight, and I usually just keep my coffee cakes, because we're making such a moist, yummy cake thing. I like to keep mine in the refrigerator, but you can keep it out on the counter as well. So if you have made coffee cake in the past and it's just too dry, just wait until you try today's recipe. It's a classic sour cream coffee cake. And now that might seem like a weird pairing, but the sour cream makes the batter come out perfectly, and your baked cake ends up so moist. So what a lot of people will do, I've never actually done this, but what a lot of people will do is they'll take their basic coffee cake recipe that they got from someone or found online, but it's just coming out a little too dry, and they'll tweak the liquid a little bit and add sour cream to the recipe. So that's something you can do too. If you have like an incredible coffee cake recipe, but it's just coming out too dry, you can add sour cream. You're gonna have to play with it a little bit, but that can be another fantastic tip. The first recipe you're gonna get, the one we're cooking today, already has sour cream baked right into it, so you can see what that process looks like. My third tip for you is that coffee cake, well, I don't know if this is a tip or something to watch for. So coffee cake is normally paired with coffee. Not that it has coffee in it, which is a common misconception. So when I wrote my first cookbook, my favorite cinnamon streusel coffee cake is in here. And I had a lot of comments from people who did the recipe and went, oh, I was really shocked to find out there's no coffee in the coffee cake, because I think that's what a lot of times people assume, but it's more so meant that you're supposed to have your coffee cake with coffee. However, with all our fancy bakers out there on Pinterest and developing new recipes, you're gonna actually find some really good coffee cake recipes out there that have coffee in them or instant coffee granules inside. So especially if you're looking for a really good chocolate flavored dessert, you're gonna find coffee incorporated quite a bit because it's gonna bring out those chocolate notes and tones so much better. And in fact, I won't make a chocolate cake or chocolate muffins if it doesn't have coffee in it, because it just doesn't turn out the same. So you will find some recipes that have coffee in the batter. However, most coffee cakes do not actually contain coffee. So don't fret if you pull up a recipe and there's no coffee inside. That's actually by design. Tip number 4 is to pick your sugar. Okay, so you're gonna want a sweet coffee cake. Otherwise, it's not gonna be coffee cake, right? This is meant to be a sweet dessert. However, depending on the sweetener that you use, you definitely can make your coffee cake on the healthier side. Or you can just go total dessert, have fun, all-purpose flour, white sugar, go for it. But you wanna pick your sugar wisely, because not all sugars or sweeteners are gonna react the same in your coffee cake. I have 2 recipes for you today. So the recipe that we're going to cook on the video is the sour cream coffee cake. This one uses a granulated sugar. And the second recipe that you can get in the downloads is my cinnamon streusel coffee cake from this cookbook. I'm gonna go ahead and give it to you guys. And that one uses raw honey. I really wanted you to see these 2 different varieties of coffee cakes. So what you can do is you can take either recipe kind of as a base and then tweak it from there to figure out what you want depending on the sweeteners that you use. So I suggest that you find a recipe for coffee cake that works well for the type of sugar that you want. Either a granulated sugar or a liquid sugar. And then you can play with the type of sweetener, but you wanna try to stick to it being either a liquid or a dry sweetener. You can look up online for like calculators on how much liquid to add back in or vice versa. So you can go there if you want, but to keep it simple, you pretty much can do a cup for cup replacement if you're just doing a granulated sweetener or a liquid sweetener. So replacements for white sugar. So the sour cream coffee cake has kind of white sugar or granulated sugar as its sweetener. But replacements for white sugar could be granulated honey. You can use it cup for cup as a replacement. Sucanate, we should probably do a video in the future on different types of sweeteners. Sucanate is my go-to favorite. That's what I use for my cinnamon streusel coffee cake. You can do organic white sugar. When I do use white sugar in my kitchen, I do use organic white sugar that has not been through all the same chemical processes. So yes, it's still sugar in your bloodstream, but we're just going for a better version of that. I buy mine in 25-pound bags from Azure Standard so that it's a lot more affordable. You could also use a granulated sweetener like stevia. There are sweeteners out there that you can use that are meant to be cup for cup. If you're looking for a low glycemic index version, you can go that route as well. And then if your recipe calls for a liquid sweetener, you've got a few different options as well. So my cinnamon streusel coffee cake, I use raw honey and it's so amazing. You can also use maple syrup, cup for cup replacement. Agave nectar, I don't use that in my kitchen, but I know a lot of people do. Or you could find like a liquid natural sweetener like stevia. That one's gonna be trickier because you're gonna have a hard time kind of with those ratios. But the bottom line is, if you're switching out sweeteners, the easiest way to do it is just look for, if the recipe calls for a granulated sugar, replace it with something else granulated. If it's liquid, replace with liquid. It's just gonna work out better. Once you know the recipe, once you've made it a couple times, you know the feel of it, then you could try changing it up and say, I'm gonna use raw honey in this one instead, and you're gonna immediately be able to realize, oh, it's way too liquidy, I need to add some more flour in, or vice versa. So once you learn the recipe, you can play around with it even more, but I suggest at the beginning, make it simple on yourself, okay? All right, the next thing I want to talk about is what if you need to make these recipes gluten-free? Now, in 2 lessons from now, we're going to be doing a whole, or next lesson, anyway, one of the next 2, we're going to be doing a whole lesson on baking with gluten-free flours. But to make this recipe in particular gluten-free, what I want to suggest to you is to use this guy right here. This is King Arthur's gluten-free measure for measure flour. So what it says is it's a 1-to-1 substitute for wheat flour. So in both of these recipes today, instead of using all-purpose white flour or spelt flour, you can use this gluten-free flour, and it's a cup for cup measurement. So if the recipe calls for 3 cups of spelt flour, you can use 3 cups of this, all right? So this is absolutely fantastic. And this one's gonna work really well. I'll talk about it. Oh, actually, I'm gonna talk about it a lot more in the gluten-free class, so I won't get into all of that yet. You'll have to wait. But almond flour is another one that works really well for coffee cakes. Now, almond flour, you're not really gonna just be able to straight up substitute in these recipes. You're gonna wanna go to like Pinterest and look for almond flour coffee cake recipes in order to figure out recipes that are made for almond flour. If you want to cook our recipes though, this King Arthur's gluten-free one is fantastic. And you also, Bob's Red Mill also makes one that says, I think it's called the 1-to-1 flour. And it's the same thing, it's cup for cup. And you can find these on Amazon. You can find them on Azure, like you can find them all over the place. So I think that's a really great way to do it if you're trying to make it gluten-free. Now, if you're trying to make these recipes dairy-free can actually be quite easy. And this is another one people struggle with. They think they can't bake if they have to be dairy-free. We will talk about that more in the future as well. But in place of butter, you can easily use the same amount of coconut oil, if you're used to the taste, or you can use another oil. You can use avocado oil, something like that. Or you can even buy vegan butter. That sounds gross, but there's actually really good, healthy brands of vegan butter. However, vegan butter, the base is oil. So you really, really wanna make sure that you're not picking one that's a base of canola oil or another vegetable oil. So you're gonna be looking for these butters at natural grocers, Whole Foods, Sprouts. This is where you're gonna be able to find some really, really fantastic vegan butter, especially if you just need that butter taste. So our cinnamon streusel coffee cake has this delightful streusel topping that is melted butter with walnuts and sucanat or brown sugar all mixed together. And I mean, you can use coconut oil, but it's not gonna be the same as butter. And so that would be a fantastic case where you could use oil in the base of the cake recipe. It's not gonna make a difference, but in that buttery, yummy topping, if you use a vegan butter replacement, it is more expensive, but for an occasional treat, it is so worth it. I've had to be dairy-free with several of my babies while I was nursing, and so I became an expert at figuring out how to get like the butter taste without using actual butter. So that's another great one, but in most recipes, you can just substitute in oil in place of the butter. So my go-tos are coconut oil, avocado oil, and olive oil. Those are the 3 that I bake with. Now, if your recipe calls for buttermilk, you can even make your own dairy-free buttermilk. All you're gonna do is take 1 teaspoon of lemon juice or 1 teaspoon of vinegar to 1 cup of coconut milk or whatever alternative milk. You can use almond milk, but I find almond milk to be very thin. I prefer oat milk or coconut milk. Some recipes like today call for sour cream. The other thing you could do is, I'm sure there probably are like coconut sour creams or something out there, which I've never used, but there are absolutely dairy-free yogurts. So the coconut milk yogurt is one of my favorites. So you can very, very easily just use a coconut milk yogurt or another non-dairy yogurt in place of that sour cream. So once you kind of figure out a few replacements, it makes it very easy. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about with coffee cakes, and this is kind of a quick breads tip in general, is to sift or not to sift. So you are going to sometimes find recipes that call for sifting your dry ingredients. So this means taking your sifter and you're going to shake it, and all the big pieces are going to stay at top, and it's going to sift out the little pieces, and it's going to help break up any lumps that you have. So you're going to sift together. Usually it's gonna have you do your flour, your baking powder, your salt, all those dry ingredients you're gonna sift. And you are gonna find other bakers who sift everything. Almost literally everything will they sift. I'm not against that. However, I fall on the side of almost never sifting because it's just one more step in my busy kitchen. So the faster I can throw recipes together, the better, but some recipes really do better with sifting the dry ingredients. So here's how to decide when you want to sift. We've got a couple different scenarios. So the first one is if you are using freshly ground whole grain flour in your baking. So you took the whole spelt and you ground it in your grain mill, and you've got this flour here. So you can sift that flour and you're gonna end up with something that's more akin to all-purpose white flour. Now it's not completely, it hasn't gone through a chemical bleaching process, it hasn't been refined in a factory. There's gonna be still more bulk to it. It's not gonna all of a sudden magically turn into white flour, but you are taking the bran and the germ out of it, at least most of it, by sifting. And so if you're making a chocolate chip cookie, if you're making something that's like a really fluffy cake and you just can't quite get the fluff there that you want, then you can sift those grains to make it fluffier. And you're still, even though you're taking out some of the nutrients, the flour you're left with is still a really good flour. So if you are trying to go for some more desserts or even coffee cake and you just want it lighter and springier, then you absolutely can sift your grains. Now, if you are using a recipe though that just tells you to sift everything, just be aware that if you're using freshly ground grains, you don't actually want to sift it, or you're gonna take some things out. What you can do if you need the flour to fluff up, you can sift it and then just dump your thing back over and add back in the bran and the germ and, kind of mix it up if you want to do that as well. But just be aware of that. And some cookbooks, if you buy cookbooks for freshly ground grain, so the einkorn cookbook, it's from Jovial, or it's associated with Jovial. I can't remember the name, but it's just like einkorn. In that cookbook, almost 99% of the recipes, they have you sift it because they want that more all-purpose kind of flour. So if you see all-purpose einkorn or all-purpose spelt flour, that's what it is. It's basically the white flour equivalent of that grain. So it's the all-purpose flour that's been made from spelt or einkorn. Okay. All right. So now the second scenario is that if you are using all-purpose flour, you're just using white regular flour, and you want a very light, springy cake like angel food cake, then sifting your dry ingredients can make sure that you have no lumps in it and that it's nice and light and springy. So when you sift it, it just really gets nice and fluffy, which allows you to you don't have to mix the dough as much then, because it's going to, be light and fluffy and you're kind of mixing it. And the less you mix it, the less gluten develops, and that's going to give you a softer cake. The more you mix, the tougher it gets. So that's why with yeast breads, we need, because we want it to be tough to get that yeast, which we're looking for. In quick breads and in soft cakes like this, we want to mix as little as possible so that it can retain its delicate nature. That's why they'll say mix until just combined, because you don't want to keep mixing. So the sifting can help you on that. So if in these coffee cake recipes you're feeling like they're just too dense, they're a little too heavy, then you absolutely can totally try sifting and see if it helps. All right, so today I've got two terrific recipes for you. The first uses a granulated honey or granulated sugar and features sour cream to make it nice and moist. This is a classic sour cream cake. And then the other recipe is one of my most popular here from my first cookbook, which is my cinnamon streusel coffee cake. I get tagged more on Instagram for this recipe more than almost any other. The other would probably be my sandwich loaf recipe, but those two are probably my two biggest ones that I get tagged on. And this one features raw honey to sweeten it. I'm using whole grain spelt. I'm using sucanant, but you can absolutely make substitutions, but it is amazing. So if you head over to bakingschoolwithjami.com, you can download the recipe for those two recipes today, as well as recipes for our past 6 videos. And then don't forget to like this video and hit subscribe so that you never miss an episode of Baking School with Jami. Today we're learning how to make coffee cake. They're very simple, but these treats are amazing for just bringing to friends, having for hospitality. I'm a really big fan of a coffee cake. This one is a classic sour cream coffee cake. It's very simple and easy to put together. And this recipe is great because we're gonna make a big old huge pan, but you can very easily have this recipe and just put it in a 9-inch pan or a 9-inch bundt cake as well. So here we are just mixing the ingredients together. We're gonna add the dry ingredients into the wet. We're gonna fold them all together, and then we are going to add the sour cream in. It's gonna be a little bit of a lumpy thing here. And now we're making the topping. So we're gonna mix the topping together. And I tried something new with this that didn't work out super well. So normally you're gonna put half of your batter down and then half of your topping to make a middle. Put the rest of the batter on top and then the rest of the topping. Well, this one I thought, I'm gonna sprinkle it on top and swirl it in. It didn't work. It did not work well. So follow the directions that are in the recipe because it just was way too much. It didn't do what I thought it was gonna do, but it still turned out delicious and amazing and such a fun treat, especially for the fall, that you can bring with you. It's so moist and delicious. And then I have actually another coffee cake recipe for you in the recipe downloads as well that is equally amazing.